In this chapter, we are going to learn about software lifecycle. So here, you are going to learn about what software development looks like, what are the different phases in a software development process. I hope you guys remember that in chapter 1, we have discussed about a simple life cycle of a software. But here, we are going to revisit that software life cycle, as well as we will learn a little bit more about each phases. So software development lifecycle SDLC, it has 5 major phases: requirement analysis, design, implementation, testing, and maintenance. In some other books, you might see it in different names, or you will see there is 7 stages or 4 stages, but the basic 5 stages are here. So the first one, requirement engineering. Requirement engineering phase is the first major step towards the solution of a problem. So when you are building a software, the first thing you will look at is what exactly you need to build. So during this phase, you will carefully identify and document the user requirements with respect to the future system. And at the end of this phase, you have exactly what you are looking to build, which is called requirement specification. So the requirement specification reflects the mutual understanding of the problem to be solved between the analyst and the client. And these requirement specification documents serves as a starting point for the next phase, design phase. So there are 4 basic steps in requirement engineering, which is requirement elicitation, requirement specification, requirement verification and validation, and requirement negotiation. So the first one, requirement elicitation, it's actually understanding the problem. You might ask, who is behind the request of this work? You will think about who will use this solution. So those are you have to understand what your problem is. Generally, the requirement analyst or the person who is working on the requirement engineering is not an expert in every domain, right? We can't expect that the requirement analyst is expert in every domain. Suppose you are developing a project, library project, but the analyst is not specialist in that domain, right? So then what he will do, he has to interact with domain specialist. So in our case, who will be the domain specialist? Professional librarians. So with the interaction with professional librarian, he has to build himself a sufficiently rich model of that domain. Thus, requirement elicitation is about understanding the problem. He has to actively participate in the construction of the domain of interest. Then he will have better understanding of the conflicts or better understanding of the trade-offs in that particular domain, and then he will better identify the problem. So requirement elicitation is all about understanding the problem. So the next one is requirement specification. So once the problem is understood, it has to be described. So you will develop a requirement specification document here, and the requirement specification document actually describes the product to be delivered. Remember that it's not the process of how it is developed, it just describes the product to be delivered. And the next phase is validation, requirement validation and verification. So once the problem is described, the different parties involved have to agree upon its nature, the nature of the problem. So we have to ascertain that the correct requirements are stated, and it's called validation, and that these requirements are stated correctly, which is called verification. So that's requirement validation and verification. You have to ascertain the correct requirements are stated and the requirements are stated correctly. So the next one is requirement negotiation. Usually requirements have to be negotiated. So when you will develop a project, you will see that there will have time constraint, there will have other factors, or the stakeholders might have conflicts that need to be resolved. So concerning all those, what you have to do, you have to make a selection from the list of requirements, and then you are agreeing upon the boundaries of the problem, and taking care of those boundaries, you will make a selection from the list of your requirements. So that's requirement negotiation. So here notice that we are using the term requirement engineering instead of requirement analysis. So why so? The reason behind is that we are emphasizing that the phase is an iterative phase. This is an iterative process, and that's why we are using the term engineering instead of analysis here. So it is an iterative process of analyzing a problem, documenting the resulting observations, and checking the accuracy of the understanding gained. So it will iterate between those. So that's why it's an iterative process, and that's why we're using this term requirement engineering. So here I have used a term that accuracy of understanding gained. So why I am using this? It's possible that the developers or the architects or the analysts misinterpret the requirement. It's possible, right? They might misinterpret the requirement. So checking accuracy of understanding is also important in requirement engineering phase. This figure is showing the major interactions between software engineering steps. So from here we can see that software engineering process is actually a iterative process, but it's not actually just iterative between these processes. I can give you an example. Suppose you are making a project which you will deploy after 2 years, but like it will take 1 or 2 years to deploy the project. So you have to done the requirement analysis 1 or 2 years earlier, right? So in the meantime, the market might change or the user preference might change. So you have to come back again to this requirement engineering phase. So it's actually iterative. You have to come back again, and then you have to go through these phases again. So that's why it's an iterative process. So it's not like you will do requirement engineering once and you are done. You have to come back and forth between these steps. So in document driven processes or approaches, these iterations precede design and implementation. In agile processes, design and implementation is a part of iteration and feedback loop. So in either case, there is a central repository in which the requirements are documented. Handling requirement specification process well is crucial for the success of any software development project. And requirement engineering not only involves technical concerns of how to represent the requirements. Here, social and cognitive aspects play a dominant role as well. So these factors make software engineering difficult. So it's absolutely crucial that you spend the appropriate amount of time in this stage to ensure that the problem and solution are well defined, well thought out before beginning any kind of design or developing work.